I forgot to hit
Okay,
record for the
cool.
intro, but that's okay.
No worries. Um, yeah, so this talk is at Rails Conf right now, which this year was like very accessible, but kind of anticlimactic. You kind of record a video of yourself and then you send it in, and they essentially spin up a private YouTube. Does anyone here actually have tickets for Rails Conf in general?
I do
No?
not,
Okay.
but some of
Well,
my team members have been and there. So one
that
of the
makes sense.
ladies that joined us won one of the won a ticket. I'm not sure exactly
Oh
how,
yeah.
but yeah, one of the diversity
Um,
tickets is awesome.
yeah. No, it's been a good conference this year. I think they're just doing the keynotes live and everything else is recorded. But so the talk, anyways, I submitted and I'm going to give to you guys today is called the Missing Guide to Service Objects in Rails. And what I mean by service objects more generically, that concept. Um, and the idea of the talk, which I'll share my slides in a second, is not actually to say like just do it this way. It's more of a here's all the various ways you can do it, because kind of Rails ends at some point and it doesn't really give you a pattern to organize your business logic. Nicholas kind of talked about it a bit of the pattern that like LoadUp has chosen, and I kind of put into that ecosystem alongside Nick about like how we do it, but it's not really the only way to do it. So I'll present my screen. Actually, kind of interesting. If I share a tab, can you guys see the screen?
I see a slide with like the bathroom symbol
Yes.
guy and your name.
Okay, cool. So good, that worked. Anyways, it's by the reason this is a 4x3 is the way I did the video is I put like a 4x3 slide, and then in like the last sliver of the widescreen, I put my own face.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's like a weird shape. But that's what the talk's about. Again, quickly, most of you already know me since I've been kind of here for a bit, but essentially, I am a person, really. I'm a male. But the bottom, there's a link to other thoughts I may have and random stuff. Kind of did an experiment where I just wrote my own blog because I didn't pure HTML and CSS. I make money writing Ruby, so that's why I'm kind of qualified to talk about this. And I've been writing it Ruby about the same amount of time as I've had this dog, I realized. And so Nicholas and Nick, or Nico and Nick would have met this dog. He's very sad looking. We were trying to mail him out one day, and he kind of forced us to keep him with his sad face. So that's about as long as I've been writing Ruby is the age of this dog's face. So anyways, let's go back and talk about service objects. So one of the things that's kind of come up, and I wanted to preface the rest of my content, was that it's totally fine if you don't use service objects. I actually was talking to someone today, you know, who's kind of in the camp of like just put it in the controller, like you're just duplicating stuff in the controller, and it works for him, he says, and I'm happy. That's you. But if you're facing a problem with putting all of your logic in a controller, a model, or wherever else you're putting it, it seems like it's kind of getting out of whack. Then the rest of this is about like, well, here's ways to kind of tackle that, but again, different. There's not a right way to do this. It's really just whatever kind of feels right and seems to sit well with your brain and your team's brain. So if you want to use them, let's start from the beginning, right? To kind of understand how we got here. So, you know, Rails is great because it's a great tool set where you get a lot of stuff out of the box. And that's what it's famous for. That's what it's about. That's the whole convention over configuration. It's a quote unquote batteries included framework. And it's fundamental, like you start a Rails app and like there's a bunch of stuff, but the stuff like you're like, I need to see something on the page. Fundamentally, the thing you're really following is like there's a route that kind of maps to a controller. It does something. It may call, you know, data from the database using a model. It may save something, and then it goes to a view to say, okay, here's what I'm done. Which is funny because in some ways the routes are kind of a parameter, right? Of like go here, and here's the parameters in the URL. The controller is sort of the body of the function, and then the view is kind of like the return to a simple function. Is the way I kind of phrase it, and everything else is really there in support of that. So, you know, if you go look at like the official Rails guide or like initial tutorials, you see a lot of examples of that flow, especially the controller that looks like this, which is like, okay, it's super easy. You just, you know, create an order by taking some params, and if it saves, great. You can go like look at the specific page for that order. But if it doesn't just render the form again by rendering the page, and you can look at the model for the form data to fill in as well as errors, right? And it kind of like enamors us. It's sort of like with React. Like you look at it for the first time, and the programming model is so simple that it just seems like, well, this must be all I need. And then like you actually get into a real world application, and this is contrived just because I was trying to come up with like an example, but like you get when it requirements like authorization, processing options that can have in between, if else's for other sort of logic that's based on the core logic to actually get a real application out there. And like you inadvertently end up here where like little feature by little feature, you're looking back at your code one day and being like, what is this? This looks terrible. It's really hard to understand. I can't figure out where the bug is. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it's like, I've written code like this, and it's like I've come back and been like, this is not a good idea. And then, even if you move that logic around, and I know you could break some of this up into private methods, it's not about just being in the controller. Even if you move it to the model, you still have the same of like, how do I organize control flow when I have not just a simple set of steps, a lot of steps, and the pattern is one where I could kind of short circuit and need to communicate back a response at any given point. So again, if this is you, I'm not kind of poking at like, well, here's crap code to say like, well, you should feel bad if you've ended up there. It's more that this is just actually the default. We all like to talk about sort of our perfect visions of code, but it's our patterns often lead us to not being that way. And that's, behind every nice successful company, there's a function that looks like that, or a controller that kind of looks like that. So you can't be defeatist about it. You got to be like, well, there's got to be a better way, even if most people haven't really encountered it. And that's really, again, where service objects come into play, right? Like we've kind of gotten here because Rails gives us a lot of patterns for routes and controllers, to an extent, models. But in terms of the business logic, it's, the conventions either just put it in the model, but not really any more detail of how you organize your logic within each sort of business process, right? I want to pause real quick before I move on. Does anyone have any questions, comments, disagreements, kind of just with that preface that I put forth?
No, I think it really fits well in some of the object-oriented design philosophy. I think a lot of new Rails programmers especially get confused with the Rails' model layer and think that their business logic all has to go in the model or all has to go in the controller, when is we really have lost the concept of Rails doesn't have a good concept of domain objects that are there because it makes sense for the application as a thing on its own right, as opposed to this is a Rails app, and Rails apps have model view and controller folders, and we put stuff in those. And so I think this is very compatible with that disconnect.
I agree with you. I like when I designed a program, I want one class, one responsibility. I often design things to control data, even if it's not a model view control, even if going with a native app using an entity component architecture, I still want my data separated in one layer. My presentation doesn't matter if it's a GUI on a mobile app, a GUI on a web app, or how I'm going to render an environment in 3D space in a video game. I want that to be separated so I can have fine-tuned control. And it's sorry.
Anyway, Riaz, go on. Nelson, please.
Yeah, I just have a question. I'm having a hard time understanding the difference between a service object and just a plain old Ruby object that you separate code out into.
I'm going to talk about that because there is no consistent terminology, and I'm going to provide some terminology I think is consistent. But to some people, a service object is something different than a poro, and a lot of people, would they really mean? I'm going to go to the next slide about what I mean service objects. Like, what does that exactly mean? And I think the most universal one of it is that, like, here's code that represents and executes a business process specific to your application that is independent. Should have added independent of a specific model or a controller. So that being said, like, there could be, I'll give you an example, right? That's kind of specific to the load up application. There's like, I have my controller for orders. I have a create to be able to create an order, and I have a database model called an order. There's a process though of like, how do you check out from a cart, right? Like that's a business kind of, it's a user clicks on it and the process happens. one of which the outcomes of that is an order gets created. And another outcome that's an email could be sent. So like that thing, that business process, whether it's a plain old Ruby object or some other construct, there should be something in your code that reflects that process to say, when someone wants to do the checkout process or sequence of steps, we do these things. And that's where you could certainly in the order model put its own like process method, or in the controller just put the code you want without creating some other object class structure to put that logic in. So that's what I mean by a service object, at least in this talk. Does that answer your question, Nelson?
Yes, thank you.
Just to clarify, make sure I'm understanding it. Say like I'm just building an app. It doesn't matter what kind of app, just an app. I'll have my plain old objects represent insert random data. And then I want a process done on that data that is not specific to anything else. So I just create like the checkout functionality you said, or the render data to screen REST API or something, and it's just it does one thing, takes in that data, and does one output with that data, essentially.
I think it does. I think it's close to at least to the way I'm defining it. I don't think it has to do a single thing. I think it has to represent a single process. So like when we say process checkout, like the checkout process could create a customer, could create an order, but it's sort of a representation of a string of steps more so than it is, or a process, more so than it is like the customer thing, the order thing. And in sort of like, I guess some people would say in an OO world, like you would put a method on, an instance method on those things or a class method, right? And my argument's like, is this thing specifically only about the order, or does it represent really a process? And that's where I think the service object comes into play. It turns out most controllers are doing a piece of business logic, and that's why you would want to potentially put them in a service object to separate the interface calling it from the actual code representing that process.
Riaz, and you may get into this elsewhere, but I guess my question would be, geez, that sounds a lot like a Rails controller. Why are we making an object that's different than just the controller?
That's a good point. And the reason mainly is that testing is the primary one. Now you could certainly go through like your controller tests, etc. The other one is that it just turns out in a lot of cases you end up with multiple call sites for the same process. So an example is you may start out an application, and in the case of the example we gave, create an order. Turns out later your company becomes bigger and you have to be able to create an order from an API call that's different. Like maybe it's your GraphQL controller, and now you haven't put your logic in a thing representing the process that can be called from either a potential server rendered page submitting a form or a API call. So testing and that.
So this is for like composition over inheritance. You have a bunch of processes, but it's basically a plain old object does one process. So when you create your controller, instead of inheriting from all those things, you instance them in that controller and then do the operation.
I think to an extent, yeah.
The way I build all my native apps is either through a pure NT component architecture or through that kind of composition over inheritance, which is sort of a compromise between a pure ECC style of programming, which is often done in native apps and games, or like a traditional MVC, just composition over inheritance, essentially. Like if you like programming this way, if you ever want to get into native application building, Flutter, Python Kiwi, and to an extent, the Godot game engines used for more than just games these days. Tesla is using it for their embedded application programming. It's weird. That is pretty much how you do things. It's just you have multiple widgets or nodes, or whatever you want to call them, that just perform one task, and you compose the screen or your object or whatever you're doing in that situation on the mobile app or game out of a composition of these things to just do one thing and do it well.
Yep. I guess I'll just go ahead. Yeah. So things to think about amongst other things. So when you're kind of starting to answer the question of like, what if I'm not gonna put in the controller, I'm not gonna put in the model, like I have to figure out some stuff about the thing I'm gonna put it in. And so I find in general, there's a lot of variations within this that you kind of have to pick, are you gonna do them in a more object-oriented or functional approach? If you're not familiar with the dichotomy, we'll give a little bit of an example in the code samples ahead. And I've tried to keep the examples very similar so you can kind of see the difference in approach. But it's a different way of thinking of programming. People prefer one or the other. If you're kind of new, Ruby does inherently lend itself to more object-oriented program. It's an object-oriented language. Secondly, how many public methods do we expose? So if I have a thing representing the checkout process, it should expose like checkout, like execute, checkout, like check valid, like how many like things executing that process, how many times or ways should it be able to invoke that process? How do we handle errors, right? So like I have 5 steps in my checkout process, step 3 might fail. And like, how do I communicate back up to the parent? What didn't work out, send back to the user, they need to fix the inputs or whatever. And that kind of relates to what a service object returns, meaning like, again, if it's a controller action calling that object representing the checkout process, what kind of thing does it return? When you execute it, where do you put the code and where is lunch? This actually that last line made a lot more sense at the conference. So when is dinner would be the appropriate line. So let's kind of look at OO versus functional. So before we look at specific code, when people say I use poros instead of service objects, in general, but it's funny because a lot of people I've all seen say I'm using service objects, but the service objects are poros. I just say it's a way of implementing that service object as a concept. Poro means plain old Ruby object, so it's like a class that just sort of instantiates and doesn't inherit from active record or anything else. It's kind of like from a gem. The nice thing is general Rubyisms and gems and et cetera, like they use this pattern. It's easy to use poros. It's easy to get started because it's very Rails/Ruby-esque. You're pretty much going to just be able to use it out of the box. You don't need a gem generally. Now the cons, and I agree this is somewhat debatable for some people. When I actually when I end up in the land of like checkout and there's 25 things that have to be checked or processed, that doesn't actually turn out, if you think of that as a thing, it's more of a procedure really than it is a object, right? Like a thing representing a file on disk could be an object where you could open it, know what file it is, have the data, et cetera. But most controller endpoints model really a sequence of steps that then end with you returning, right? And also there just are inherent challenges. You have to add a little bit of syntax, et cetera, to compose and nest these, right? Like object-oriented means you're most likely inheriting versus composing, and that tends to be a problem for reusing a lot of the private methods that could be in one object in another object. So pros and cons. We'll just look at really quick code, and again, I know people could organize this differently. In the left, you have, let's say, an orders controller create. You would create like an instance of an order creator, pass in the data that you're going to use, and then say, please try to do your thing, like maybe perform could probably be renamed to process. And then you say, did this work or did it not work? So the difference is if you had to do all the code on the right, which is just, again, it's a poro, it takes some stuff, it does a perform that may, each of those methods are private methods. You can kind of see them as a sequence of steps, but they do a logical set of actions. And then you can ask the result value, whether it worked or failed. And some of the insides of those, private methods there could actually call other services if needed, right? Just in a plain Ruby way. And again, just looking at like what some of those private methods could look like. This was very late, to be honest, when I wrote this one. I think I was a bit annoyed and I just wrote, pardon my French, if you read the code example. Yeah, like you can, and again, like the build and price sort of illustrate, you could essentially call other services and execute them back. Now, again, the composition here challenge would be that if this is meant to be a private method, that build and price order, you might have a challenge if you want to reuse the exact same thing in a different place. It just, you have to now take that stuff and put it into another class that could be invoked from here and this other place. Additionally, the raise, again, you may have different private methods returning at different times. Just a return doesn't communicate maybe, hey, I failed, short circuits the whole thing. So we're going to talk about options. You could have to use exactly a raise, but it's a very common thing that I've seen in examples for OO versions. I'm sure, again, there's this some variations here, but at a high level gives you a paradigm for how the OO world looks. And then you have the functional side of it. And it's a little bit different. Those of you that are just familiar, maybe functional programming is a term. I didn't give a good exposition. It's simply the notion that you don't organize your programming world with an object, like an order pricer that has both data and functions, but the functions themselves are the most important things. And you're just, so your things that have data in them are a separate thing from a thing that's the sequence of functions. So I would argue that in most cases, it's a better model for how to think about service objects, because most service objects are performing sequences of steps. It's much easier in general to have a larger number of steps, because you can kind of, just from a human perspective, kind of look downwards a set of steps versus kind of jumping around, which is kind of how you work in OO land. I do like it better, but that being said, the purpose here is not to say do it my way, it's just to say here's a bunch of ways you can do it. There is a learning curve if you're not familiar with functional programming, as Nico kind of mentioned before we started. It's also much harder to do this particular approach without a library in Ruby, because Ruby is not inherently functional. And if this is Elixir Phoenix kind of thinks this way by default. And so you end up with a much easier time. But in Ruby, you're going to want to use a gem. And we're going to talk in a second about the gem that Nico, Nick, and I use at LoadUp. That's just one of many that is moderately popular and the one that we really like. On the right here, the kind of like thought bubbles, are basically like different terminology you can look up will lead you to this pattern. It's some variations, and I don't fully understand all the nuances between a state monad and what the command pattern is, but like they kind of all look very similar. I'd say if you're looking for good material, state monad, bad thing to Google, because you might end up in a world of complicated terminology. But if you look up command pattern, railway pattern, interactors, and like find the material on that, you're going to find a lot of material that helps kind of acclimate you to this way of thinking. And I wanted to, like, I thought this particular one, which I will share the slides after this, was so good. I'm just even putting a whole slide here. Well, maybe you can pick it up. Yeah. It's 50 slides. I'm not going to go through it, but like, if you're like, I want to understand functional programming without even, knowing specifics, like I haven't seen a better talk. And this is actually how your command, railway pattern, whatever works, is like each step has inputs, does a thing. And if it fails, it short circuits to the end. And then if it continues, it just keeps the positive one keeps going to the following step. Oh, wait, you guys can't see that slide. Never mind. Go look at the slides yourself. It's slide 23 I was looking at. But essentially, yeah, sorry, was sharing the wrong part. And the gem we're going to look at in a second. I'm introducing it now just because the examples of the functional approach that I'm going to show you are using this gem. This is the one that we use at LoadUp. I like a lot about it. I dislike some about it, but it's a pretty good one on average, and it's for us been stable for years. We haven't had almost any issues with it. All right, so the functional version, and there's some syntax here again that's specific to that gem. I'll kind of walk you through it line by line, even though a lot of it looks similar. So on the very top left, you see a controller, and in general, in most cases, OO classes can tend to have like a finger, like sort of like a way, it's like representing a process as a noun to make it kind of a thing. Generally in functional programming, you represent the process using like a verb because it's a thing you're doing. And then you still pass in your stuff, but essentially don't think of it as instantiating a object that kind of sits there. It's instantiating like a sequence of actions. And so in the bottom right, it's sort of like you literally look from top down. So like that's the call method that we just called in the top left on like def self.call params user. And then in this syntax saying with, meaning like make a bucket of data, and then reduce means like kind of go through these steps. And those are capitalized in that way because they're actually written as classes, not as sort of private methods. So they're in like usually separate files. So imagine the build and price order would be a separate file entirely that would be named as a class. And then in this syntax, which almost all of the functional gems have some variant of this, where there's like a sequence of like, here's the things I expect on this context, the user and params, and here's the order, which means the promise part where I'm going to add this key back onto the bucket of data, which means like the next step after this is access to user params and order, right? Because now a thing was added. And then you have a function block essentially that is the thing to actually do. So you kind of get that separation. And if somehow build and price order, again, if I had a separate service representing how to get this data in a little bit differently from a API call from it needs to be reinvoked, I could probably reuse this, maybe send emails, right? Because it's actually the same logic and I can just insert that into another service. So this is the composition part of functional programming. And we were talking about kind of inheritance versus composition. So functional programming is inherently more composable, which allows you for the benefit of reuse. But the con is it's not very Ruby-esque. And so some of these things are kind of DSLs that have to be added on. And just, it doesn't work the way that some people think, I find, just because they think in more OO way, and that's cool too. So I did put a slide, and I realized actually after the comments I got from the talk that people were really interested in this part of the talk, and that I should have put up like a list. However, if you go to Ruby Toolbox and look, we have a category now for service objects, and there's like 17 options in there. If you're kind of interested in this, and about like 2/3 of them you'll see are very functional in the way they think. So you have a lot of selection there. And light service is one of those. So before I go on to handling errors, just wanted to pause again, see if anyone had any questions, because there's no way for me to see your faces and the slide at the same time.
Are there any?
Go ahead. Yep.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I understand it now, but yeah, at the beginning I was asking, you know, how does this differ from you know, mixing in behavior using like a concern, controller concern?
You could certainly even write your controller concerns in some ways, the internals of them in a functional way. The primary difference between that would be the inability to actually execute that process independent of a controller, which would mean like in order to run your tests, you have to go through the controller. Secondly, if you ever wanted to execute this process entirely from, you know, maybe a background job for some reason. But you know, the other thing I found is that in a lot of cases, if everything is a controller input, you can represent every process, right? Just in the controller, because otherwise you end up making this one-to-one where it's like, I made the service object, it's only called in one place. And like literally I'm just copying and pasting this code over. But if you then have other business processes that need to run like overnight or run in a background job, now you've got these like two places for business processes to live, and that would be the other thing.
Okay. Yeah, it totally makes sense. Thanks.
Yep. But I would agree that you end up with a lot of cases you can't end up this one-to-one match, and it's sort of like, if that really bothers you, then that would be a problem of this pattern. And like I said, I actually talking with a developer now and helping him a little bit who like very gung-ho against service objects in general, and this total like there's been even an episode of Rails with Jason that's like, I don't do service objects, and they're more problematic than they really help. And my point is like, there's also like a lot of applications that just the way they design, the way their business logic is, don't really need this problem. So it's really a good tool to do as if you're anticipating having a lot of this business logic that's not just straight CRUD, you know, where you don't need more than 5 lines in your controller, right? So
cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
This is just to make sure, this is the command design pattern. So when I'm using the command design pattern I've been mostly building native apps and REST APIs for the most part, not just these giant, you know, monolithic websites. Nothing wrong with that when that's the right solution, but for my stuff, it's not. How would you work with this along with the observer pattern? Because I often pair the observer pattern with the command pattern. Basically, if this event happens, the observer then delegates things that need to be done to several commands in the command pattern, so I don't have to rewrite a ton of stuff. And it's more modular and decoupled, in my opinion. How would you implement that?
I don't think they have to be in conflict, because essentially, like well, I guess I didn't show it to you, but like the railway command pattern, right, is generally like modeled as like, I have a thing happens and it can succeed or fail, and then like the success just goes on to the next step, the failure short circuits to the end. Now, if one of the things that happens is please queue this other thing, right, like broadcast a message, like that is an event. And the listener could simply just listen to that message and even have its own kind of functional approach, or even OO could have its own approach. So like the fact that the invoking pattern in a more traditional sense is a controller invoking a synchronous set of steps that then complete. And if you want to prefer that, hey, I want one of my steps to be to broadcast an event, it's perfectly fine for the start point of another service to be the listening or the hearing of that message. And it kind of goes actually to John's point of like, why would you model it this way? Because it could be that a business process needs to be kicked off by listening to some sort of event system within Ruby, and is not always the controller endpoint.
Okay, because that's how I am building my current the game I'm building in Rust, but also its backend API. I want to be able to basically have community events and stuff like that. So the backend API I'm building right now is essentially command and observer pattern. I'm using Flask, and I do plan to eventually build something in Ruby again. Not that anything wrong with Flask, it's just I'm getting bored with it. And I just like this matching of these paradigms. So I was just wondering, how would I combine them in Ruby rather than Python or Rust or Go or whatever.
Yeah. I think in effect, Ruby's kind of get that pattern because this tends to be a lot of times if you have to have an offshoot like that that's not required immediately for the response to the HTTP cycle, you're kicking off a background job into Sidekick or delayed job anyways. And that essentially is kind of like, send a message that I need to run this background job asynchronously from my kind of main process. And so I think that's maybe a really good way to think about modeling that, of like the things that occur asynchronously are modeled into background workers or jobs. Yeah. That's purely, I think, personal Ruby preference. I do almost always use named parameters instead of I think we have cases in code bases where it's like if it's almost always a single parameter and it's obvious, like fine, you can save some keystrokes. But if there's more than one, we generally have just gone with named. I don't know if that interacts with this pattern. It's just more of a personal preference. Yeah, I think the only challenge I've had with that is that Sidekick, if you don't use active job, does not like named parameters, apparently. Which I found out recently. Still doesn't. And they do it for performance reasons. And so that might force your hand. Yeah, which is surprising to me. And there was I think Mike Perham's answer to it was that like active job, he's fine supporting active job. It's just that active job, because of the extra niceties, is about 100x slower because of the deserialization and serialization of params and all that stuff. And so it just depends on the needs of your application. If you're, if that performance penalty is not a big deal to you.
Yeah, Riaz, I had a question around the light service. When an organizer calls different actions, do those actions happen concurrently, or do they happen one and then the next one happens, then the next one happens? If one of them fails, then it just exits out of the entire call.
Yeah, so the way it works is that like in that call method, that sequence of actions, which are just these other classes. So here, if we had on like this, I guess you guys can't see my cursor, but the CTX or context.fail and return and passes like an error message back up, that's going to mean that the send emails in this case, or in the charge order, never occur. And then on the top left, where you guys have the result equals create order, that result will be failure. So the result, if result.success will be false. And then if you do result.message, you could listen to like what was the error that occurred. It also includes, I think, like a separate way you can send on a failure, you can have a message and an error code if you want to have like an explicit list of errors that you can then queue other behavior off of.
Yeah, so in that particular case, that would be pretty bad if it got all the way down to the send emails, but then that errored out. Because then in this particular case, it already charged them.
Yeah, and so there's tricks around this for this, and this is something that you have to do kind of no matter what pattern you do, but in that like this is that kind of classic, like I have an active record thing and I've got a sequence of things that only make sense together. If I'm taking money or doing like things like calling external APIs, what happens? And so in general, what I've kind of done is taken everything, like we've had a pattern where we kind of take everything that should occur that can be reversible and put an active record transaction around it. And then like the point at which you charge, you know, which is like usually the key in our version of create order, like the key event we can't back out of, right? Because we charge money, then everything after it has to occur outside the transaction. In this case, we're not, the send email is occurring kind of if there was a transaction within it, but you could actually just wrap, like you can actually just do 2 with blocks in here and the result of the first with block is you pass into the next with block, with meaning like the actual with params. And so we close once the charge is done, we at least will never get rid of the database call. If the email failed to queue up or whatever, which usually they're just queuing a background job, then the order still all exists. And the worst we're dealing with is the customer didn't get an order confirmation email. So I think that kind of helps. I think you have to do that kind of regardless, where like, this is kind of always a challenge for me, which is like at some point, I need to make sure if I'm charging money that everything before it already happened. And active record transactions are nice because they do have that like erase history ability. It's much harder, I think, in this world. I don't have a good answer if you're in the service-oriented world. This is one of the challenges with that world because like, if you're talking to different services and one of them fails, it's really critical. It's very hard to tell all the other services, oh, no, I'm kidding, cancel. You know, you've already talked to them and like, they're already off doing their thing.
That problem can be solved.
Think about that problem.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I have a quick question. It is a good practice to add service suffix to the file name. For example, create order or create order service. It's a good practice.
I think that is totally up to your team. We do it that way. We do like we have like an app lib services directory so that our names are like services, sysadmin, user, create orders, create, you know, or something like that. Or because we have so many, that helps us organize it. So I think having an organizing function identifying that is a good idea, but some people may disagree because like Rails models aren't like models, whatever, right? Like it's just sort of at a top level namespace. But we do talk in a second about like namespacing these and breaking them out, like really having a clear organizing principle for the directory structure and the file names early on is a must. Because otherwise you just can't find your code, regardless of what your specific opinion is. Like, just don't make it inconsistent. This is like my only kind of big thought on that.
What I was going to say is the problem talking about earlier, where if one of the services fails and it's a critical one and other ones keep going as if it was running, that is a situation where I would use the observer pattern. Basically, if it fails, emit a signal, and then all the things that depend on that service working, constantly observe for is it working or not, and check for that. That's where that would come into play in my applications I build. And I was just thinking that would be a good situation. And for Alex 6, whatever, I would recommend the class file name and the name of the class itself be the same. I write my code, it's one file to one class. It's one class and one possibility. So it's pretty easy to find.
Yep. Cool. So let's talk about handling errors. And this is actually, this is the one that got me introduced into looking into this topic. And it's really about when things go wrong, right? So let's say even if you're kind of doing the object-oriented version of it, you have like a method which is like to be properly organized, broken into a bunch of small methods, and at some point, like 5 methods down, when you're like changing the string pattern of a list of strings, right? It should be something trivial. Some glitch happens and it raises, right? Or you just know it's going to fail. How do you like organize that within the service object and communicate back up? So there could be a few other examples, but the ones I've generally seen are nested conditionals. You can raise exceptions, or you can use throw catch in Ruby. So let's kind of go through each of those real quick. So I generally in this talk, I'm kind of giving people a survey versus saying do it exactly this way. This is one of the few cases I'm like, don't try to go this way, right? So it's really easy to understand how someone could start with it, because it is, you just use those statements, and it kind of like, when you say it out loud, it kind of makes sense, but it is very hard to read if you're coming back to your own code. It's also much harder to break apart, because like you're depending upon this complicated nesting. And so like you can't see the different components as easily. So, or if you have to move things around, it's kind of hard to track your own nesting. So you kind of see that it's like you can do like something like check authorization. Okay, if that works, now do the next thing. If that works, and so like because you're doing this if check, you're kind of, that's your binary tree, right? Of like, if not, then do this other thing. And you could in this case also have a lot of else's, which is like render 401 not authorized. Okay, well that one didn't pass. Now it's like a render return 400 because it's bad data, right? Like you just get this really complicated mess to read. So raising exceptions is the most common one that I've seen, just because like you don't have to worry. Like if you have this sequence of things and you could have something reaching to another thing, you can always just raise it, short circuits the whole thing, goes back to the top level to wherever hopefully you're rescuing it. It's familiar. You don't have to worry about how you've broken apart your code into various private methods. But it has a challenge, which is exceptions are really slow. A lot of Rubyists, I don't think, have a full understanding of this. I did some reading about it. That the thing is, whenever you raise anything as a part of your application control flow, it has to gather the stack trace because it's the same as raising an error that has to be handled by an error handling service, like something went wrong. And that takes a long time and a lot of memory. Now, you ask me like, well, like the official Stripe Ruby SDK, right? Like you say, execute transaction, and the way you listen for like, oh, invalid CVC code is to listen for an exception. Like it's part of the normal process flow in that gem and a lot of other gems. That's why I kind of say maybe I kind of get why it works, but it has some drawbacks. And the pattern here would be, again, when you're calling that service object in your controller, that's where you kind of can generally rescue errors, or I guess even within the service you can rescue errors and then return some sort of other object to say success failure. So throw catch is a final alternative. Now it's been in Ruby forever. I don't think I've seen as much of it, and it functions very similarly to raise and rescue. Except it is not slow. It doesn't raise a stack trace. It's designed for control flow. In fact, it's really designed for like while loops to break out of them. And the way they kind of work is like if you look at where it says some error equals catch, but halfway down the code, you'll see that it's like, okay, wrapping this symbol, like catch this symbol, and then inside of that you do some stuff, which is the authorized method. And if you look back at the authorized method at the top, it can do a throw, which is again just built into Ruby, a specific symbol, and then therefore you catch on the parent. And then the result of the catch is either a length. And so if the length is 1, that means that error happened. For most of the functional gems that we were kind of sort of talking about earlier, Light Service, a few others, a lot of that one specifically does use this mechanism internally to execute that fail and return, where it doesn't do all the rest of them. It's like essentially does a throw catch and to be able to kind of short circuit your code. Kind of functions like a little bit of a return. So yeah, return values. So I guess I'll pause again really quickly. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I know it's already 8 and I've got just this section and one more section to go. Does anyone have any kind of thoughts, questions, perspectives on that?
Throw catch, is that Ruby's version of try catch except in Python or
try catch. I think try catch. Yeah, I don't know if try catch should be closer to raise rescue or throw catch. So throw catch is purely just control flow. raising actually is meant to be for, raising an error, something went wrong. But a lot of times in actual Ruby programs, like exceptions are kind of used for like what should be normal course of business control flow. And then just arguing from a performance perspective to orient yourself towards the throw catch.
I think that's awesome. I honestly either I didn't know about this difference. I think I assumed that throw was a synonym for raise. I was like, that's really interesting.
Because when Python, or if you're writing C, C++, they have the match statements, which is basically if any one of these things happen, do this. If any one of these things happen, do that. And I've used the similar command pattern in multiple languages that either use cases or match statements, which are basically the same thing. Ruby has match statements. Rust and C languages often have match or case, depending. I think Rust has match. That's pretty much how we'll do this command pattern. If whatever condition happens, run this, emit the signal. If else, I'm sorry. It's easier with a diagram.
So I think where a lot of people have seen like try catch is in JavaScript, especially if you do modern web development. You do a lot of like try this catch error, then do your command pattern or your catch flow. The cool thing about this is you can throw from any level in the Ruby block that you're within, as long as there's a catch somewhere in the outer scope, and you can throw any error of any type. And catch that at any point in the upper or the outer scope. So it allows you to write code like this, where you put the catch somewhere else, and you can throw at any point inside that block.
Would that be useful for implementing a reserver pattern in Ruby?
I don't know. I don't know much about the observer pattern, honestly.
It's very similar to this, but other code blocks also be listening for that same throw. So I know in Ruby there's namespaces. Could you make several things namespace wide and then?
Well, the throw catch only works within a contextual block. So you'd have to, wrap every observer you want to put a listener on would have to execute all the code that could potentially throw inside of a block inside of itself, if that makes sense. Like Ruby objects, you can send messages between them, but the throw catch is not meant for that. It's really for, hey, inside the block that I'm executing, if I throw something with this error, catch it and then do this else block.
Well, one way you could do this is use these server's objects and then have a controller composed of multiple server's objects, composition over inheritance, and have one method is basically the message handler to combine the composition over inheritance server's objects with the observer pattern. That would work.
Yeah. Yeah, so in general, I think like most people try to have an enumerated list of the throws so that to make sure the symbol matches. And I will also say that I think it really depends on the way you're organizing. Again, so if you're going to sort of, I don't want to gem, I want to use plain Ruby, which is going to lend you to most likely using objects. You might have to use the syntax directly. I think in our case, we found that if we're using a control flow kind of gem that helps you do the command or railway pattern, most of the time that's what they're doing internally, but you don't actually have to, like error handling is kind of a first-class citizen in some ways in most functional programming paradigms. And so this, in some ways, this whole topic of error handling is really a bigger concern if you're doing the Poro version of it, because you have to come up with your own system versus just use one given to you and designed by a gem. It's gonna be a pro or a con, depending on what you're kind of going for.
Thank you.
So I have one more thing here. I understand that you're in the previous section you're trying to catch errors, but the end result you're trying to get a result at the end. And would it be useful if you just said, okay, you can get two things back. You can get a success result object, or you can get an error result object, and not deal with the throwing and the catching, and just deal with the end result.
So that's a
Object.
good question. I think if you kind of think through this, then if we go back to here, right? So imagine that in this case, here we go. On the very right here, you see the perform method, right? And it's doing a bunch of stuff. So imagine like the build and price has, nestles down to a couple other lower levels. And at some point, maybe this build and price is actually much more sophisticated on this next slide. And you realize, like I can't do this. They gave me the wrong input, right? So that function from that call point, you can really return something to communicate all the way back up to this perform method on the right. Hey, please return a result, class object. And how do you do that? Because if you just return, it's just going to even if this build and price order just returned, it's just going to end up here on this middle line. And return just means, yep, I'm done doing my work, go on to the next thing. So you need some way to signal, even if it's within this order creator class, to say, please communicate back up into this sort of parent. So in a throw catch, you might wrap this active record based transaction with a catch and have ways to do throws from within these private methods, because it may not be one level. It could be 5 levels down in methods as you're breaking apart little methods for your business logic.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So going on to return values, and this is kind of a little bit related to your question. So you're calling from a controller, so what can the controller access? When the controller's order creator or create order call, go do, right? It's expecting to get something back, and what can it get back? There's another option on here I didn't put in there, I kind of lumped into the true false. You can also just return a simple value. You could be calculate answer to the universe, and the return value is a number 42, right? But it could also just be true false. It could be structs or open structs. We'll talk about what those are. They're sort of constructs built into Ruby. You could also return custom classes. And again, if you're going the functional route, you're most likely organizing around a gem, and you basically live with what the gem provides you. Because again, this notion of what you return is kind of the thing the gem will define. It's going to return a thing you can ask, success, false, etc. So true, false, again, if you're doing your own thing and not using the opinion kind of imposed upon a gem, you can just have true, false, right? Result can be, it worked, it didn't work. It's simple and universal. There's no way to really confuse it. It's a big pro, but it has a pretty large con, which is that you can't access the data that you might after you've done your order creator want to be able to say, no, I want the order. I want to know the ID of the order to how to redirect someone. And if something went wrong, you can't really access any data out of it. Maybe you wanted to do result.orders.errors.full messages, whatever it is, right? Or have a specific error key, like payment failed. So if you look at the right where the red text is, it's that's kind of where this pattern has a bit of trouble, because you just don't get any extra data back to that the other parts of your application could reasonably want, right? You don't want to expose everything, but you want to get more than it worked or didn't work. So structs or open structs. So if you're not familiar with this, I do recommend they're great tools that you may, whenever you want to reuse them. A struct is essentially a primitive, think of it like a hash, but you can use dot accessors. So you can do, your struct you've created dot whatever, as well as you only have a very specific explicit list of keys. So it kind of helps you by looking at your code to be well, what can I access on this? Open structs are the same concept, but they're more flexible, where you can dynamically define the data that you put onto your struct. So pros generally easy to use. Go ahead.
Is this basically the same sort of struct, the static struct, not the dynamic struct, that is in statically typed language like C and C++, or maybe Rust or Go? Is it the same type of concept?
Someone else might be able to answer that. I'm not exactly sure.
Because the syntax is similar to a Rust struct or a C struct, as essentially.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
That does answer it. I would use it like a C struct, but not to manage pointers, but to just pass a value essentially.
Yeah. Yeah,
so it's
and actually the way
more
that
like an interface in Java or C plus or C sharp, where it just okay.
so I think the hash point's kind of an interesting one because I think what I mean by structs, open structs, is I mean like a thing that represents like a hash-like thing, like a key value store, and therefore you can ask it the single level keys you're probably going to ask it for are like the thing that it created, success, false, error message, um, and at least structs, open structs, and structs you can also create on the fly. Hashes. The nice thing about them is again they're very simple, easy to use. We use some variant of them across so much of Ruby. You can define custom payloads for service, which means they're very easy to create in line. So there's not a lot of boilerplate to adding a new result type for a particular class. You can attach error context in a dynamic way, meaning like you could have in the bottom, it says error string. You could have like error data. It could be an array of things. You can just add whatever you want. And the con is kind of its strength because it's really, really flexible, right? So you now have to kind of, when you're invoking a service object, to make sure that some other developer didn't call it success true false, called it like finished true false or completed. It doesn't put many guardrails around you doing that, and you have to sometimes even run the application to know exactly what's going on this struct or open struct. Like, what is this data structure? Which can be a complaint about most dynamic programming because there's no types or without RBS, there's no types. I guess the answer could change here. I don't know exactly how structs interact with RBS if you're using the new typing system. But you kind of get the point. It's just a key value kind of structure of your data, of the kind of outputs. Custom classes. So like you could create just really a class, right? Which is kind of like you give it a bucket of data and you can ask it questions. And then you can use kind of class inheritance to kind of have like a base response class. It's still flexible, which again, you can do a whole lot of stuff with it. It's direct, very familiar to people who are using OO to return like a success or failure class. It can result in a lot of noise and a lot of extra code. And I think one of the challenges is like, you probably in some ways may want the result of the execution of your service to be pretty dumb because you want like all the logic and the things working to be in the service. And then the result is really meant to just be data to know what happened. And you can be very tempting to add cleverness into the success or failure class of data that it's doing computation to determine various things versus if you look at the bottom right, like in a success class is just death success, true, right? Like, and so that I think would be the challenge. You're probably going to get someone who's just going to try to do a bit too much and with good intentions end up in a bad place. I'm just going to do this last slide and then we'll do Q&A because I think it's very, very close to the end. So the final question that I've put very little content in here is, where should I put this code? And I thought about this a lot about trying to give you options of like organize it by domain, et cetera, or be more Railsy or whatever. I found this to be really simple. Don't let the internet confuse you with too many opinions on this. Really, the only thing that matters is that you have a pattern. It's generally better to group by domain, so you can have like an app, services, orders, customers. So it could be active record models. It could be like user types. A way that is intelligible to you and to your team for how your business people talk and how you think about your code. But moreover, it's that like just be consistent, because the worst thing is that people get used to a pattern, and it's not the pattern's fault. It's that you have to like, this is hard, that someone want to change it halfway, and now you have multiple patterns, and so you've lost the purpose of organizing your code at all. That's just my only recommendation is just keep whatever pattern you pick, more so than there's really a right or wrong pattern. So that is the last slide that I have. So, questions, comments, suggestions?
What is the link to the Slack channel? Because I keep trying to join it and weird crap happens.
That's Ruby on Rails link. We'll take care of that offline for this, Bailey. Okay,
I really like this, how you decide to implement it. I think the way I would probably do it is I really do prefer the functional method for a lot of stuff, but I would probably, if I had to do something that was heavily OOP, like using Ruby or Python Django, I would go for custom classes and then use composition over inheritance, and then use, if I'm using Ruby on Rails, use the ability to send messages between Ruby objects to implement some sort of observer pattern to handle errors. Or I would just use open structs, or maybe a combination of all that stuff if Ruby objects can handle structs, which I assume they can.
Of course they can, because a Ruby object can inherit from open struct. I mean, it is just a Ruby object like everything else in Ruby. Riaz, what would you say about the I'm playing devil's advocate because I don't necessarily subscribe to this view completely, but I want to kind of voice it here. So there's a line of thought that says that service objects is just an approach to reorganizing our junk drawer, that we should just go back to better object-oriented design and have better methods that on our objects that are express the things that need to happen a lot, so that service objects are just shuffling the deck and aren't good designed.
So I don't know if the opinions are incongruent, but I would kind of I think the biggest thing I found to the purists that I've read, and I've listened to a couple of interviews with, I think people, I forget their names, are a bit purist on this, was that I don't think it's that OO is wrong. I think it just may not be the right pattern to model some class of problems. And so that's a hard thing to say, no, OO is right in all cases. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would just say is that most 90% of people, because this talk kind of does have a lot of talk about kind of pushing a bit of the functional angle, is that if it was the right pattern, it should also be the one that kind of fits with the fact that everyone's kind of doing it and feeling a lot of pain, is a good reason to maybe reevaluate, right? There's sort of the academic argument, and there's sort of the well, we're all trying to do it, and at least for some people, not all, right? It's a problem, so maybe they should listen to their own kind of instinct of hey, I'm having a pain point here, then sort of just follow everyone else. If you have a problem, that's kind of my response to it, is sort of do what works for you, and if it's not working for you, don't force yourself to keep doing the same thing if it's painful. And it's just sort of the thing of well, this is the way to do things. It's no, feel your own pain and respond to that, experiment. So
I agree with that. Object-oriented programming can be very powerful, but so many projects I've had were utterly ruined, either when I was the idiot who modified the base classes and broke the code, or just the code being too highly coupled. That's why I'm looking for more design patterns designed to basically decouple as much thing as possible, so to minimize breakage. And this is why I actually like the what's it called? Service worker system. I can't speak today. Service class.
So actually, I did have a kind of maybe a thought related to Frank. Your last point though was the thing I keep kind of saying is what's the right kind of programming model for this question is if I said we needed to write our active record models in a functional approach, and someone people who are actually in the functional land try to do that, they're no side effects, everything's a pure function, right? And then they're yeah, but we do need to go to the database sometimes, right? And so you end up with their dirty actions they put in a junk drawer and don't want to look at, and it's no, a active record model really is a reflection of a thing in the thing that usually manifests itself in a structured row most of the time in a database. And the right programming model for that is a thing. It's the data from the row and then things you can validate or access from it. But a lot of controller endpoints are actually procedures. Like that's what we're actually doing. And maybe if you're having the pain point, then model it as a functional programming is a good evolution of procedural programming, in my opinion, for the basics.
So in your talk, you mentioned that you use the light service to do your functional programming. Is it because you found like lambdas and passing blocks for behavior to be insufficient? Is there what do you especially love about using the light service gem?
Yeah, I think you actually could very much write lambdas and procs. I always forget the difference between the two, and just write your own thing, kind of like in a Poro way. I'd say in general, the nice thing about having a gem, especially because Ruby is not inherently oriented towards functional programming, is usually like the same reason why we use Rails. Of like, hey, there's an opinion of like how to pass back failures, error codes. So you can have, there's a skip function in there to skip the remaining steps, but not fail. There's sort of the code pattern. If you're really interested, that particular gem has macros like do these steps until. We don't use them. So it's sort of the same reason where it's like there's an organizing principle and function to using a gem. It's not something you have to use, but if that's a thing you're looking for, which is especially if you're not really tried the pattern a lot, it's good to have a gem to kind of go by. And then you maybe in your second iteration are like, no, I don't want to use a gem. I just want to do it by hand, right? That's a good point. I think I tried to write it with lambdas and procs, but I did struggle a little bit with like how to not make it confusing on a slide. So I kind of switched over to showing it in the gem version. I don't know if that was a good idea because you have to kind of know the gem DSL. But it was just a way to explain it in a concise way.
Yeah, Dave, you want to jump in?
To your point, Frank, about people giving flack or whatever about the whole idea of service objects to just maintain your code, I'm okay with that. You know why? Because that means my code is maintainable. Opposed to other situations, and as I preface this with, I absolutely love the open source project GitLab. I self-host it. I've paid for it. It is an amazing project, but I'll post a link here in the chat of their user model. And it's an open source project, so you can look and see the user model. It's over 2,000 lines of methods. That's not maintainable to me. In order to go and do something that's in relation to the user, I'm going to have to mull through this, not every bit of it, but at a 10,000 foot view, it's overwhelming. And if I can't just at a glance on my single screen without scrolling to get some kind of context of what all is happening here, then I don't think that's maintainable. At least not to the point where, what is the company value? A smaller number of files or developer velocity? And ultimately, I think that's what it comes down to is I would much rather have a bunch of files that's very well organized, as Riaz emphasized, and have this service object pattern, or call it whatever else you want, because I know that the whole term service object is a trigger word for some because they have a very specific context of what that means to them. And I think in the Ruby community, at least, we have taken this idea of service object and used that term as a dumping ground for our plain old Ruby objects, for actual service objects, which also return the context of the objects that we're working with, in addition to a status of fail or pass, success, whatever. So I don't care if someone makes fun of me for using service objects, because you know what? My code is going to be maintainable in the long run. And that's what I care about, that and my developer velocity.
One reason I gave up, and I'm sure it was configurable, but I think there was a tool called Code Climate that I used for a while. It would always warn me whenever my objects would reference another object more than themselves. Like, do you want this method? I'm like, no, because I want this thing to just act upon these other objects. It's like jealous object error or something. I just found myself disagreeing with that being an anti-pattern in context. Thanks, Dave.
Nick and Nico, I guess you should take a look at that file because I know you're new to the load up team and kind of way we do it, and feel like, can you imagine having to go through that instead of going through the 25,000 files we have?
Yeah, Riaz, why don't you close your talk by telling them how you want to tear light service apart and completely rebuild it?
So this is kind of funny related to the service object thing. Like, one of my only complaints about light service is that they have some extra stuff in there that Load doesn't use very often. Like, you can have like these macros instead of those sequences just being like, do this as like an action with a class. You can do these clever macros to like iterate, reduce, like whatever in sort of with the sort of meta DSLs inside the sequence of steps. And I've been like, I don't want this. I don't want anyone using this. And so like I forced the gem, and to really understand, because it's so much of the low code base, I just started ripping out code and started testing against mainline. And so I got down to where like the things we actually used and did are in 4 files, and they're like 150 lines of code. And I was like, everything else can be ripped out. And so I'm kind of going down this path of like, maybe I should like look at this again, kind of write another gem from it and call it lighter service.
Lighter service.
Yeah. I guess there's value to the things that some other people may want that are in there. So not, like the gem is amazing. But
it's lighter service because he wants to light it on fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a great name. I actually agree with that whole this concept. Try to keep things as minimalist as possible. This could be a trigger for anyone, so be warned. I actually, for my Linux machine, I run a lot of the suckless utilities, just very simple, very minimalistic C programs that just work very reliably, consumes next to no RAM. It's really nice. I'm running dmenu. I'm not running DWM right now. I'm using i3 right now, but dmenu and just a ton of these really simple programs that are easy to maintain, easy to fix, easy to add new functionality, easy to remove unnecessary functionality. It's just a very simple, clean, maintainable code base. I really love the Unix design philosophy, and every time I try to do something, even as a user-facing app for normies, not arch Linux nerds like myself, I still try to make it follow the Unix design philosophy as much as possible.
It's a good one.
I think one of the other interesting things is John was asking earlier, if John's still there, about like, hey, is this really a bad idea to maybe put this in a controller concern? And one of the things I found kind of funny, because we went from like put everything in the controller to put it in the model, that like I actually find that if someone abuses one pattern over the other, or just not abuses but takes it to an extreme, you get the GitLab situation if you put it all in the model. At least if you left it in the controller, it's actually broken into like where it's being executed. Like you have the harm of like, okay, I can't test this independently of the controller, but like at least I can just look at the 25 lines in the controller that relate to that process versus going to the model where there's like every business process is put into one giant file. So like,
yeah, you're tracing function calls through all these different layers and models. That's frustrating. Ted, have a great one. Thank you.
I was reading this thing. Isn't that where we use the like a query module or a query class, where a lot of those processes are happening potentially where it is a controller process? Well, instead of dumping it in the model, dump it into a query class of some kind, almost as if it's a service class, quote unquote, doing the same thing where you organize those calls that you're looking for, your queries, what's happening there. Like, could you apply that same query class pattern to, I guess, yeah, could you apply the same thing instead of dumping everything in a model and making super fat models, bring in essentially your own service class? Like, is that where you end up?
I think you
class in that context. Sorry, Riaz. I'll be quick. One thing that I've done in order to organize code, where let's take the GitLab model, the user model, where it's 2,000 lines long. One thing that I've done is actually use the concern pattern. So I'll actually create a concern for these 5 methods that are all grouped by the same kind of idea, and I would namespace my concerns folder with the model name pluralized, and then I would create whatever that kind of action is that those methods are doing, and then just have a bunch of includes in that user model. At least then you are just extracting out that code and putting it somewhere else that's still very relatable to that user object, but it is now more isolated. So if you don't have to go work with user authentication parts or display parts or whatever, then you can go look in the concerns for these specific pieces that you want. I kind of break that pattern where concerns have to be reusable across multiple models. I think that's always a great idea and the most ideal use case, but I'll also use them for isolating and namespacing properly my method so it is a bit more organized.
That's an interesting way to think of it too. I guess concerns would be an interesting way to break this stuff out, to just say like, because you can use controller concerns, you can use model concerns. I think there's some cons because you still have the ability to say like, hey, if you have the challenge of like importing multiple concerns that have like similar private methods almost, that you could kind of get conflicts. There's some small potential drawbacks as there are with any pattern. But that's another interesting one I haven't thought about as much. That's a good point. Yeah, and I think kind of like when I was doing the Q&A at the RailsConf version of this earlier today, it was really interesting to me. Of all the things I talked about, people really honed in on the functional part as like the thing that kind of like drew up their eyes versus the O, because it's such a departure. The thing though that we also kind of started talking about was that like a lot of times, and this was with one other person that was like kind of a psychology kind of student also, was like, it's weird to them that when we talk about programming, the computer doesn't care about any of these, right? Like Ruby like just sees like random like values in the stack pointing to see things, right? But this is all the question of how like we can understand this logic, and like which means that like the way we should be studying this is not like opinions on what's best from a programming academic perspective. It should be like, let's get 100 people and try to have them learn this thing and try to learn that thing, and like which one has the fewest bugs, like from a human perspective, because it's really a sociology or like more of a psychology question, right? Like there's nothing to do with how the computer executes the program. We don't really study these problems that way, I realize. Like even from this talk, like I'm not like showing like, well, someone tried this and that, and the study showed that like people were 5 times less likely to have a bug if they use this pattern, right? Like that's what we should be doing, but no one's doing that. Because like we think there's an academically, like it's like almost like we think it's math. It's not math, right? It's like more about our interpretation of like how can a human read this? Because we kind of equate the programmer with the machine, and then it's actually not the same, right? Like we are very dumb. We're the like morons smashing random buttons, and the computer's like, all right, finally figure out what you want.
I don't know if it's dumb, but we have very high level heuristics for programmed logic that is like,
well, what I mean by dumb, I mean like dumb as in like, if we have to do the raw underlying, like if we had to memorize every pointer and see that Ruby's pointing at, you wouldn't even need the language, and you could just be this like crazy efficient, right? At like how you program. But we really, almost all of our effort in the programming world is about how can we write stuff that I can read and that someone else can read.
Right. Well, I mean, you're pointing back to the fact that if we wrote a manual on how to program in a language versus the actual implementation of the language, you have some languages that the entire interpreter can be implemented in like 100 lines or less of code, right? Like especially things like Lisp, where it's very recursive.
Same thing with
teaching
Lua.
someone how to program Lisp is a completely another matter. I mean, you dwarf the actual implementation. That's because our brains don't work at that level of just raw procedural execution. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think DHH did a talk where he basically said the same thing, and that it's more like an art than a science, and that we should work on our artistry.
maybe.
I would
Yeah,
agree to
I-
that statement as well. And I am, just by the way, learning Emacs Lisp. I do have a Vim config, either in Viml or NeoVim uses Lua. But I was going to make a similar setup for Emacs because I'm weird. So I've been learning Lisp, but it is a pain.
Anyway, I gave that as an example of an early stage self-hosted language. So anyway, and the recursiveness. Thank you, Riaz, and I think that's a very good point. And I look forward to your new computer science, human sociological study approach, and how you get into some peer-reviewed journals with that kind of stuff.
I know one time there's the meetup. There is a professor who studies this at Kennesaw, and I was trying so hard to get her to come talk because I just was like, we need more of this in computer science. I was just like, how do we let's study what kinds of features of programming languages are easy and hard for learners to learn, is what she studied, and we just never got the timing right. It was 2019, yeah, but it was really really interesting stuff.
That would vary depending on the person. For example, I don't know. This is probably me being autistic. The reason why I found learning C, C++ to be easier than learning, let's say, Python or Ruby, because it's so explicit and hands-on. I actually find that easier to understand, more intuitive. But other people probably find it to be an utter nightmare to have to actually statically type things, manually manage, and et cetera, et cetera. So that would be interesting study.
Yeah. Anyway, Thanks, Riaz. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
See you guys next month.
And
thank you, guys.
Yeah, that was really good, guys.
I'm gonna hit stop on.